Welcome, brothers and sisters of Holy Cross Academy and St Mary the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church. Thank you for joining us today via the interweb. So, today we're talking about our capital campaign, Growing Our Legacy of Faith. I have with me David and Mary Ann Herring. Woohoo! Thank you for joining us today. They agreed to participate in this filming session partly because David's mother is helping out with the campaign. We won't lie here. She was able to very gently twist his arm. But they graciously agreed to help us out here today as we film this session. So they'll be here. You may hear some questions from them as we go forward in the recording. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us today, Father.
Amen. And we'll start by talking about the theme and where it is then that we plan to go here. First, the theme, a little bit of the history on how the money was raised, and then concretely, what are our plans and how people can help by prayerfully considering. One of the things I start with in the group sessions is just starting with the theme and what we're trying to do for this capital campaign, that we came upon a theme prayerfully that is growing our legacy of faith. And the reason we settled into this is because growth is about organically becoming more fully what you are. It's not about changing who you are. It's about expansion. And we love that image of becoming more fully what you are. I love Pope St. John Paul said in his encyclical to families become what you are. And that's been a phrase that I've always thought of as a beautiful prism through which to see family life and even the life of our parish family. So that was how we came to the word growth. Legacy, because we recognize that every generation stands on the legacy of those who came before it. So that we have the facilities, the parish, and even the history that we have at St. Mary's because of the work done by so many faithful Catholics here in Fredericksburg for a long time. So looking at that. To be honest, one of the other reasons I picked that phrase was the reservation that I had felt in my soul to some degree when I thought, oh no, I get to do another capital campaign. This is my third capital campaign in 25 years of being a priest, so that I understand where parishioners come from with, oh, we keep moving, and everywhere we go there's a capital campaign. And as I reflected on that, I said, we are always trying to improve the legacy and trying to leave things better for the next generation and for our children. I thought that expressed that the richness of the word legacy captured that. Okay, so growing our legacy of faith, and finally faith, because while we're talking about buildings, while we're talking about financial things and how to be able to accomplish the goals that we have, it's faith. That's the bottom line. By trying to improve our facilities, expand our facilities, grow our facilities, we're doing that so that we can have more space for the work we do of helping the faith to grow. And it's about creating an environment where that can happen. So that's how we settled on the theme, growing our legacy of faith. And one of the things then that is so important is understanding our history and where we are. When I got here to St. Mary's in 2016, I often repeated the phrase, tell me what we do and why we do it. I can actually tell you where I was on the campus, right out by the stop sign at Stafford, when Father Rooney told me, hey, we're expanding the school. It was a great moment in my life. I said a word that I had to go to confession for. But I said immediately, okay, if this parish is discerned that it needs to expand the school, then I will do what has been discerned, and I'm here to serve this parish family. And so that process of learning what the dreams, hopes, principles, how people want to see their parish grow is essential, I think, for a pastor. So that you're shepherding the flock that you've been given, not just, hey, here's what I want to do. So that process, I arrived in 2016. I learned of the plans to expand, and then putting this all in the growth process of this parish. And so I start here on our slides with our honored past, that the church downtown on Sophia Street was built in 1858. In 1862, it served as a field hospital for wounded in the Civil War. I wish that we still had that church in so many ways. When this property here was purchased and this church here on William Street was built in 1971, it was built for $400,000. At the time, the then Bishop of Richmond said, "We're not in the real estate business," and the property downtown was sold. I think that's a privation personally, to lose a church where Mass was offered and people prayed for 125 years. But amen, blessed be the Lord. Yeah. And the next big step in our history really was building Holy Cross in 1997. That, I believe the number for that was $4.7 million. I don't have that number written in the book, so that's what I'm trying to pull out of my memory here from many conversations. But again, great generosity of the people of Fredericksburg to say, we want to continue Catholic education, the Montfort sisters having left a year previously. The next big capital endeavor on the slide here is we show 2010 rededication of the church and the renovations and additions in 2012. So a lot of work went into this, putting in the organ, then renovating the building where we're actually filming this right now, which is the parish offices and library. Originally, this was offices on one level here, and above was the residence. It was all renovated into offices, and the priest residence moves across the parking lot. So these were some of the major capital endeavors. And then this context of the work that was done in 2010 and 12 set the stage then for when I arrived in 2016. That was the immediate previous history. But there was another thing that happened there, and that was that in 2012, there was a $100,000 gift given to Holy Cross as essentially seed money for the expansion. The parish at that point still owed well over $3 million, probably over $4 million at that point. I haven't looked at that number because mostly I focused on when I arrived, the number of the debt when I arrived in 2016, which was $3.6 million. And so we look at the history of that fund, that seed money. It was interesting that $100,000 is given and it's dedicated. That means that no pastor could come and spend that money on something else. That's why, despite having millions of dollars of debt, that money founded the St. Joseph's Expansion Fund for Holy Cross, and it sat in that account and has continued to grow and fundraise, and a lot of work went into doing that. And so this graph here is fundamentally showing the trajectory in broad strokes of that $100,000. And then, as members of this parish family, you remember auctions and fundraisers and all sorts of things, and thousands upon thousands of hours of great work that went into that, into raising that. And that got us to today, as of June 2023, $915,000. When you for all the money that's been raised for that, plus the interest as it's been gaining interest. One of the things that I said, people will often ask a question like, where did that money go? That's where it is. It's been on deposit. There has been, in the history of that account, one withdrawal. And that withdrawal was in 2018. Because when I arrived in 2016, the understanding was that this will cost $2 million to build. I call that a napkin number because it was a number that was made in consultation with architects and contractors, but it wasn't one that was based on bids out to the actual subs and the design work. So as you start to build, you say, well, what can we afford? And so you're aiming for a target, what it will cost. So I'm showing that expected cost there is a low line. It's actually zero, only because we didn't know. We didn't have firm costs at that point. And then in 2016, the napkin number of $2 million. When I arrived, that was a number Father Rooney told me in the parking lot. And then in 2018, when we did the work with WAC Construction to actually price it out and see what's this going to cost, the answer was $4 million. That's a big delta. There are always rising costs. That is one of the difficulties. And so That led to a number of questions. I'm going to jump ahead and say, where's the number now? 6 million. And so when you look at these lines, you have one line of over 11 years raising $900,000, 915, and the only money spent paying the contractors to get a firm bid. I will say in 2022, when we got another bid firm, we just paid directly out of the parish and paid for that directly from the parish because I was like, I don't want that number. I don't want another drop over there. In hindsight, I would have loved to have just paid for that with cash from the parish so that there wouldn't even have been that single drop, although it was a reasonable expenditure to find out what it would cost. So $2.6 million, $6 million being the current cost. That led to, in that 2018, when we said this is $4 million, the next line I'm going to show you is it's an approximation straight line of the debt. When I arrived here, we owed $3.6 million in debt. Now that number stands at 1.2. Wow. So we straight lined that down. That $3.6 million that we've actually cleared more than $3 million off of that. And you say, well, those numbers don't pass second grade math. The reason being there was one more house purchased 2 years ago that was really a generational opportunity, so we bought it. And the parish has been paying down that debt consistently since I arrived, and even aggressively trying to reduce that principal at every single chance that we get. That also set the expectation, as I described to folks, of we've made a promise, we've discerned that Holy Cross is the next thing. That meant, qua pastor, that I had a responsibility to be cautious with capital expenditures. And that principle of getting down that debt has been one of my top priorities. So let's go back here to 2018, because 2018 was the point where now we have a number of, oops, it's going to cost 4, not 2. And so there were many discussions with the Finance Council where fundamentally what I said was, why did you think we could afford 2? Like, where are the numbers? Where's the data on this? If we have fundraising here, and at that point we weren't yet at $1 million, as we're still just a little bit below. So why did you think we could afford to, let's round that up to $1 million. How did you think we could afford the extra $1 million? To borrow $1 million to construct, in principle, is a $10,000 a month mortgage. And so I said to the Finance Council, how are we going to pay for that? Is the school going to pay for that? And if the school's going to pay for that, where's it in their budget now? Yeah. How are they going to get an extra $10,000 a month? And so the principle that has worked well and served this parish well for many years was building on future growth. So Fredericksburg experienced extraordinary growth. After the new millennium, there's been a lot of development, number of parishioners and the offertory rising. And so that growth slowed fundamentally approximately 2012 through 17, and where we'd been previously growing very strong in offertory, there was a 5-year period where we grew an average of 1%. That's below target. Normally, when we look at financial predictions and financial models as we're projecting out our finances for the next 10 years, the diocesan principles fundamentally you show 3% growth, kind of a cost of living sort of growth in your offertory. So to not hit that growth for 5 consecutive years, that put a crimp on that model. And so as I brought in a CPA and a couple of long-term financial planners, or as I affectionately call them, numbers nerds, who love to look at spreadsheets and do those kind of things, their answer was, we're going to struggle with the current mortgage in a couple of years, in 3 years, much less borrow more money and add to that debt. And so that was a hard, because there's certainly folks who are saying, hey, let's continue to borrow. I know we finance things. We finance homes. We finance cars where we don't have the cash up front. But when you do so with Here's how here's why I can afford this. Here's how I can work this into my budget. That's responsible parenting in home life. It's also responsible fatherhood as a pastor. And so those questions and getting the best financial advice I could out of the parish led to the difficult decision to say, we're not in a position that we can afford to do this right now. And so the next slide that I look at, the time of discernment. How did we discern then the need for a capital campaign? Because when we saw that we're going to struggle where we currently are, that was part of the reason for, we've shown in the booklet here, 2018 an IMPU survey. As I was having some advisors say, borrow the money, I asked myself, and I said, let's ask the people in the pews, what do they think? And I was trying to prepare myself. If I get resounding from the pews, borrow the money, like I'm going to have to come up with a way that I can do that responsibly, if that's really the will of the people of this parish. But Fredericksburg, I will sometimes say, Fredericksburg isn't McLean in Northern Virginia. This is practical people. People were like, no. Lower the debt, fix the roof. The top priority was Holy Cross, actually, by a thin statistical margin, but very equivalently neck and neck was lowering the debt and fixing the roof and all these practical things. And I thought, in one way, that's a testament to the face forward mission of this is our next goal. And people were supporting that, but they were also concerned about doing so responsibly. I summarized, the number one comment essentially was, build what we can afford, build what we can afford, build what we can afford. And so that's a principle that actually made it here into the booklet when we get onto the page when we're looking at the design of Holy Cross. It's a principle that underlies then how we are making decisions about what we're trying to build. Because fundamentally what we're trying to do with this capital campaign is we've got this steep line of rising costs and this more shallow line of fundraising. We're trying to get those lines together so that that's going to be what we raise determines what we can afford to build. And so they're hard questions. They're still hard questions that have to be answered because we don't yet have final bids. We don't have biddable numbers yet. And we're working this campaign to stretch as far as we can so that we can build what we can afford. So one of the other things I said a few minutes ago, more than a few minutes ago now because I'm going on pretty good, that it looked like the numbers when we're looking at we can't afford more debt because we're going to struggle with our current mortgage. And that, if you did the math, that was in 2018 plus 3 is 2021. Well, here we are still. How are we still here? What we did was fundamentally, we did an increased offertory program. So you may remember that in the bulletin where we put out numbers. We showed a little step ladder, and we said, this is the number of families that give at this level and this level and this level. Because you can't just say to everybody, hey, give $10 more every week. Like, no, like the lady on Social Security, that's not going to work. Other people may be able to do more. And so the principle I used was just laying out where people are and asking people, can you prayerfully consider taking it to the next step? That campaign was successful. It led to an approximately 15% rise in the Sunday collection, which was great. When I talked about the years where we didn't have the growth, boom, in one fell swoop, we're catching up. And so that was a huge help. The second thing, oddly, the pandemic. Which how did the pandemic help us financially? There are probably very, very few parishes you can count on your fingers that can say that in this country. How it helped was that the day that the SBA announced that schools and churches qualified for COVID relief loans, we had applications on the desk at First Union Bank within 24 hours. We used our local bank because we had a relationship with them. Many parishes use a bigger bank, BB&T, because of the diocesan connection there. BB&T wasn't able to process them as quickly because they had so many more applications. So not every parish got those. Between the school and the parish, we got more than $500,000. And so that was extraordinary work of our bookkeepers, both at the parish and at the school, because each one has a separate bookkeeper. And then, because we kept everybody employed, even the young folks who answered the phones on the weekends got their checks faithfully despite being closed down for months on end. We kept everybody employed, and so ultimately those loans were forgiven. So that more than $500,000 in cash more than made up for the drop in the collection. During the pandemic year, when we were closed for 8 to 10 weeks, I've lost track. Thankfully, I've lost track of how long we were completely closed. During that time, the collection dropped only 7%, which if you figure we were closed for almost a sixth of the year, that's extraordinary. What does that mean? It means that the people of St. Mary's mailed in their checks, switched to Faith Direct. Some even sent in extra money saying, hey, I know it's tough times. So dropping only 7% was extraordinary. I know I've heard an average around the country was 25%. I know that some places dropped as much as 50%, but blessed be the Lord, thanks be to God, St. Mary's stepped up in an extraordinary way. And when I started the campaign and I went out and started asking folks and talking to them and having the same conversation, the answer that they gave me to that was, well, Father, St. Mary's was here for us. St. Mary's didn't close its doors. St. Mary's had adoration all day, even in the worst of times, from 6 a.m. even to midnight. St. Mary streamed 5 times a day, kept us connected to our parish, to our priests, to our family, and that, kept us connected in a way that we're grateful for. We ended up, because of that, even picking up some people from other places or who had gone to other parishes or maybe live a little further away who started coming here like, no, St. Mary's has been here through the worst of times, like we're staying. And so while the collection went down just 7% that year, the next year when we were still slowly ramping up, remember the lovely little cords on the pews, every other pew, and the numbers and all that great, wonderful, happy memories. The following year, as we were slowly ramping up, we went back up that 7% collection. And so that we hit the pre-pandemic year collection, even in that year when we were slowly ramping back up. Again, extraordinary generosity, people stepping up. And then last year we went up 12% in the collection, so that there's been growth. People have been responding and grateful for how the parish is drawn together. And that's how, through good stewardship, through generosity, and through people responding generously, we are in a very different spot than we thought we would be, because all of that growth has put us in a position where we've been able to even aggressively continue to pay down the loan and even set aside a little more cash to be able to launch this effort. But the distance between the lines of cost and savings were such that the answer was, we're going to have to do a capital campaign because we're not keeping up. Even with the increased offertory, we're not keeping up with the increased costs. So the third element then of the discernment was, because I asked myself, well, how do you do this? When I was made a pastor and had to do capital campaigns and build a church and now expand a school, the answer is the Lord provides. And so after that time, as we started coming out of the pandemic, folks who went to the leadership dinners may remember that for every year I kept saying, there's a path forward, involves a capital campaign. Do we have anybody with program management experience? And I kept asking for that. And at least 2 years that I asked for that, I didn't get even a nibble. And then it would have been, in August of 2021, when we had that leadership dinner, that I had 2 people with project management experience step up. Donna Herring, who has been a godsend, blessed be the Lord. We also had Mary Owen step up with Stafford Printing, and her family's done wonders in helping move this project forward. Mike Cattell is another member of the building committee, 25 years of experience. And so the Lord put all these people in my path in a timely manner that I said, okay, the Lord provides. And now he's provided the skill set that we need to be able to do this. And so that's how, even despite there being a recession and this being wonderful economic times, in fact, I'll say the joke here because I always say that it's not, the Catholic president or the orange president who brought on a recession. Whatever your politics may tell you, it's me. It's Father Mosimann. I take the blame. When I start a capital campaign, economies crater. And I laugh at myself, and there's humor in that because it happened in Leesburg when I went to build a church. We did a campaign as the economy was cratering. But in divine providence, I actually believe that there's a plan behind that from the Lord, is that people are giving not out of excess, but out of sacrifice when times are difficult. All right, so how are campaigns run? This is a fundamentally important question for how we structure things, because people will have ideas based on what they participated in. I describe that fundamentally in a campaign, there are three essential elements, ranging from ultimately least money raised to most money raised. And those three elements are: one, solicitation at a distance. When you write someone a letter and you say, hey, could you prayerfully consider giving $10,000? You may do math, divide by the average number of active parishioners, come up with a number and say, hey, well, if we get this, it'll all work. The problem with that is how many people read letters today. They sit on the shelf that's looked at as spam, essentially. And so that does not bring in great results. Everything you do, promotions, announcements, mailings, that falls into that buckets will increase that and make it a little more effective. But fundamentally, there's a cap on what you can do there based on, in one way, the comfort, that there's not a challenging aspect. The other end of the spectrum is the individual visits, individual asks, and you sit down with every family and you say, hey, could you prayerfully consider doing X? This is the most effective. It can raise 5 to 10 times as much as solicitation at a distance. The third element that I say is it's group meetings. And so where you'll sit down with a group, and the classic example of this in fundraising is the pastor invites 5 couples over for dinner. He wines, he dines, he gets to the end of the dinner and he says, hey, I'd love for you to prayerfully consider giving $50,000 each. And the Herrings walk out of that dinner and they look at each other and they say, why did Father invite us with the rich people? He couldn't have been talking to us. When you ask for a number like that in a group, it's so easy to deflect. Well, that's not us. We can't be talking to us. And that's one of the weaknesses of that strategy. The general, what I call the professional methodology, and one of the reasons individual asks are successful is because it's built on tailoring the ask to every single family. So that I have literally sat in someone's home and at the end of the dinner said to them, would you prayerfully consider giving $1 million? I've had to say those words. And I tried not to smile and not to choke on them and not to be like, I can't believe I'm saying this. Because in that methodology, they'll train you in fundamentally, you don't apologize for the number because then you've walked it back. And that can be effective because fundamentally you're challenging somebody to think, oh, if this is going to be accomplished, I got to step up big. And people will respond generously. So that's effective. But when I looked at that, and that was the plan, I said, this is the most effective, the individual visits, the individual asks. But once I said, we're going to run this ourselves, because hiring that consultant for a parish the size of St. Mary's and the amount of work that's been done, it is no exaggeration. In fact, it's probably underselling what it would have cost with the work we've done, that we've saved $500,000.
Wow.
I believe it.
Because you end up with a company, you'll pay $250,000 for them to help you set up the campaign and analyze the data and organize the campaign, and that'll give you 3 months of program management on the campaign. But then once you exceed the time, they charge you $1,000 a day. and you keep extending that campaign, and they want you to pay that because it makes money, right? And what I discovered and said was, once we have it set, it's not rocket science. You need somebody with a skill set who can keep people motivated and organized. That's what program managers are trained in. And so I said, we can continue to do this ourselves. I don't need to pay the $1,000 a day. In the end, that has proven ultimately true. So in this instance, as we started to organize this campaign, we actually went out and asked companies, 5 campaign companies that work on this, can you give us the data? We'll give you our parish list. Can you tell us what to ask people? Because if that's an important part of this methodology, I don't know how to come up with that number. In fact, I had a few conversations in campaigns previously when I would say to a family, can you give X $1,000? Where they'd say, where'd you get that number? And I'd say, well, I don't know. We paid this professional. They told me to ask it. Yeah. So in that case, I was able to deflect, right? Because they're back at me and the professional. And that sounds nice, a professional. But I love physics. I love science. I love numbers. And I'm a nerd myself. And I always said, how do they get that number? And so when we asked companies to bid, 4 out of the 5 said, no, thanks, we're not interested. Why? Because they weren't interested in just the data, because that's not where the money is. The money's in the $1,000 a day person managing your campaign. And so we tried several more. And in the end, the more I looked at it, and I should have mercy and not give you every detail under the sun, but the more I looked at it, fundamentally, how do they get that number? It's wealth engine reports. Because we have 2 numbers on folks, essentially. That is, we have Sunday offertory, what people put in the basket in a measurable way. So if they're using checks or envelopes, not loose cash, because we can't track that, obviously. And yes, I know what families give to the BLA. I mean, I get a list of that. Yeah. Do I ever look at it? No. So that's data that's available to us. And so you can use that, plus then interviews and discussions like, well, who's involved, who's successful, and they'll do some word of mouth, and they won't tell you their formula. But the more I looked at that, the more I said, I'm not willing to spend, some of the bids were $100,000. One bid was $100,000, and we'll go talk to your top 60 donors and find out what you can get. And I said, I can go visit the top 60 donors and not pay myself $100,000. Thank you very much. Right. Like, why would I do that? Yeah. Or they would offer for thousands upon thousands of dollars a 3-page report on people. And I'm like, that's creepy. Like, what am I going to do with that? So the more I looked at it, fundamentally, wealth engine reports are, people scrape data. They know what you do for your jobs. They know where you live. They know whose names are on mortgages and deeds and things like that. And it's big money in tracking that sort of stuff. And so I said in the end, I'm not willing to spend the parish's money on paying somebody to investigate your finances. I haven't yet met a single parishioner who wishes I'd done that. So I presume you will. Right? I don't think I will either. And so that also then shaped the decisions. Why am I talking about this? Because if I look at these 3 elements, the solicitation direct, that usually involves asking a number, or the groups, I use the analogy of, it's like art. You have your 3 primary colors, you combine them into beautiful ways, and you get Van Gogh or a Rembrandt or a JPEG. And in a similar way, every campaign is combining those things. But what was unusual was to structure this campaign on, we're not going to ask anybody for a number. I do not have a number that I've been asking any family. One visitor I know at least once asked somebody for a specific number. I told him, no, don't do that. That's not the methodology here. When he came back and told me he'd asked for X, and I'm like, you weren't supposed to do that. All right, so that's 1 out of 800 and some visits where that was done. But that principle, my hope is that by not asking folks for a number, one, it's a little more free response. I can talk about where we are, about average pledges or things like that, to show the needs and the magnitude. But in the end, everybody's freely deciding. Those were the principles that we fundamentally built this campaign on, of doing it volunteer-led, doing the work ourselves, personal direct solicitation. I found that I had to do, once upon a time in college, I had a work-study job of calling donors at dinner time to ask for money. Worst job in my life. Although, wait, I did some plumbing of things that may have been worse than that. All right, amen. But that was a miserable job. I hated it, and I was literally the worst at it for 6 weeks, the first 6 weeks. And I finally one day got up, walked out for 15 minutes of a 3-hour shift, which you don't get a break like that. And I came back and said to myself, I know two things. These people love this university because they've given money, and I know I'm a student here. That's all I know. And I just said, I'm going to talk to these people. I'm not reading that script. And by just talking to people, I went from worst to first. And that was a critical lesson for me. And it really shaped how I do fundraising, how I do capital campaigns. Because the answer is, if I care more about the people than I do the number, then the Lord's going to provide.
Yes.
And
Amen.
and that has proven true in every instance. And so I'm grateful for that. That's how we set this campaign up, to trying to visit every family that will let us. If they prefer not to have that, yes, we've opened up now the group meetings in a way to say, okay, if you're more comfortable, you can't possibly think of sitting with Father for 2 hours, what would you possibly talk about? Amen. Here's another option. All right, so next. So what we have in front of us here are the plans for Holy Cross as they currently stand. That if we're going to build what we can afford, we've listed these priorities in order of priority from A through F. And so the first priority for both Dr. Fry and I is to get the preschool over to the main campus. I believe in doing this for a couple of reasons. First, being family friendly. If you have a child in preschool and a third grader, getting to 2 different campuses is unnecessarily burdensome and difficult for parents. You've lived that, I can tell. So blessed be the Lord. And I believe if especially you start getting into the situations, encouraging people to have families, you get a preschool or third grader or sixth grader, will be a great help to families to be in one location. Equally right there, in truth, is security. The preschool on the current campus of the parish has many more entrances and is fundamentally a less securable building than the school. Evil finds a way, unfortunately, and we've been all painfully aware of that by watching the news. However, we can do what we are capable of. We can make an effort to make sure that we have security practices and principles in effect so that we're not a soft target, and even the things that you can do and the way you can build to slow down evil. For example, this current summer, the summer of 2023, we're adding a shatterproof film to doors and windows over at the school so that if you hit it with a crowbar, you can't get through. And that's going to slow down anybody who would try to get into that building. It may not in the end absolutely stop them, but if we can slow them down, we can save lives. So that principle of security and improving the security and having what I call a lockbox, buzz-through zone where people have to show ID to get into the school. These are some of the things we're trying to accomplish at the entrance in making our school as safe as possible for our children. The next priority is that if we put the preschool into the wing of the school where the kindergarten is now, we're sliding all the other classrooms down, and ultimately we're going to need more space for the middle school. The most efficient space to build and the most efficient way to build is slab on grade, and that's why we put this rectangle at the end of the middle school wing so that we can build new classrooms from the middle school in a way that's efficient, that's cost effective, but that will also meet the needs. One of the things that happened actually in most of the designs, the design that's in your booklet shows 4 classrooms. Well, as we talked with staff about where are we going to put art, where are we going to put music and all these things, One day, Dr. Fry said to me, I feel like I'm trying to make chicken salad. Can I have a piece of chicken? I said, Steve, what do you mean? He said, I really need 5 rooms for the middle school. I'm like, well, then let's build 5 rooms. Let's not make this less than what we need.
Yep.
One of the principles is that when we accomplish this expansion, if we're able to accomplish it, all this square footage, we'll be at approximately 97% of the maximum size allowable by code in Stafford County for a building of this type of construction. So they classify buildings according to the construction materials, the roof, the trusses, and all that sort of things. And the construction form and type that we have here will be maxed out at that. How do you get around that? Because you're sitting there saying, what does that mean? You'd get around that by building another building adjacent with a little breezeway. There would be ways to get around that if you were to do further expansions one day. But that also means let's be responsible, because in one specific building, this is going to max out what we're capable of doing. That's one of the reasons why we said, for example, let's put the 5 rooms out there. Another thing that happened in the design development over the past year was the middle school teachers asked very nicely, could we have a bathroom, Father, like from our middle school room, we have a 5-minute break and we have to sprint down the hallway to go use the faculty restroom and run back. I thought that's a reasonable request from an adult to not have to sprint to the bathroom. And so we're looking to put a little room up in that wing where they will have a faculty-only restroom. Because it's a new expansion, yes, there'll be additional restrooms for the students, because that's required by code. So we're looking at those sort of things of how can it make our teaching better, make our educational experience better, because we're not fundamentally adding, well, we're bringing the preschool over, so we're adding those seats. We're not, making bigger classrooms to expand classroom size or any such thing. We're trying to better serve the students that we have. Then letter D would be a cafeteria expansion. Currently, the cafeteria is in the gym. That's how Catholic schools run, right? In fact, a couple of years ago, we added a curtain so we could divide that gym in half, and sometimes use half of the gym for lunch, while the other half is being used for recess. That's great. The school has been like, thanks be to God, we've got more space, we can use this better. That space is now full from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Having a dedicated space for eating, and then a space that will also allow for when you want to have something else go on. You might want to bring the 2nd and 3rd grades together, or preschoolers are going to be in their room. They may need to come down to that space to get some craft time. So there are lots of ways that will benefit the school, but especially starting with having a dedicated space for eating. And then letter E is new playground, so that because the middle school wing would go where the current existing playground is, we need to move that and find a spot. We also need to have some playground equipment, at least a dedicated playground for the preschool over by the preschool. That there are things that are required by code that we're looking at all those requirements as well to make sure. That's why letter E is moving a playground over towards the wing where the kindergarten and preschool are.
Would we keep the current playground, just move it, or
probably not.
That's feasible.
So, good question, and probably not, because we're probably going to have to put in new equipment. Okay. The one thing that I've said, because this is what I've been told, is that no one will move swings. No company will dare to move a swing because of the liability. As a child who grew up with swings and managed to not break my neck, I would hope we could not lose those, but that's going to be a challenge. Yeah. The other equipment, a lot of it is honestly ready to be replaced. Okay. So it's probably going to have to be new equipment. If there's some that we can repurpose because it's still in good condition, we will. We have a meeting, actually, good question, because the meeting is next Friday with a playground consultant. We're going to walk around that space and look at what we can do. Okay. But excellent question. Then letter F is relocating the chapel. And you might say to yourself, Father, you said these were in order of priority. What kind of Catholic priest puts a chapel as the last priority? And the answer is the kind of Catholic priest who already put the chapel into the school. Last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, Dr. Fry and I were in conversation and said, Steve, we need the Blessed Sacrament in here. And he said, I'll give up my conference room. So he's moved conferences into his office, which isn't as spacious, but giving that conference room up for chapel has been a great blessing to the school to have Jesus there at all times. And so we understood, though, from the beginning that that's a small room. It would be nice to have a larger room because that room isn't large enough, for example, to have both the 7th grade classes in there at the same time. And so we'd like to have it so we could have, all of 2nd grade, all of 3rd grade in there at one time. Some of those things.
I know I'm not can't on record, but what is the plan then to expand it?
Okay,
How are we gonna expand it?
so when you look at the map, what happened is the original letter F is where the library is. And so one possibility was that we moved the chapel to where the library is. And so that's why there are 2 little F's for relocating the chapel. That's great. It's an existing space. It would not be too difficult to repurpose it. You're talking furniture, paintings, furnishings, stuff like that. However, about 3 months into this campaign, I was out on a visit and I'm looking at this map and I'm talking to a family and I'm like, that's not the spot the chapel should be. I said, why isn't the chapel up front? And I walked into Steve's office and I looked around and said, Steve, look at these front offices. Those are drywall. We can rip out drywall and we could put the chapel by the front door. Wouldn't you love to give up your office for Jesus? And he looked at me and he thought, are you serious? And I'm like, well, yeah, would get you an office. Yeah. So the other letter F shows putting Jesus by the front door. I don't want to lose children, especially in the younger wing, walking by that door, learning to make the sign of the cross, learning to reverence and being able to, that teachable moment every time the children walk by the chapel. I don't want to lose that by moving the chapel, far away from there. And I'd love every child to see Jesus first when they come into the school. Mm-hmm. But that's going to cost money because tearing down walls means renovating spaces. Renovating space is more expensive than painting. And so this is why this is listed as a priority. If it comes to a decision where I have to decide between getting a cafeteria and using an existing space for the chapel, I'm going to be prudent. I'm going to get the square footage. And I would encourage maybe in 5 or 10 years, once the debt would be paid, I'd say, well, then maybe you can move the chapel to the front. I would believe that would be a principle. Again, building what we can afford. I'm looking at that saying if it's going to cost a lot of money, that if that's a price driver, then we'll look at that seriously. Putting the chapel there, though, does... we can put the office on the other side, so there's still a spot where the office would be right by the front. The principal's office would be moved into where the current chapel, previously a conference room, is. So we do have some plans to do that, but because that involves a little more renovation, that's why that's listed as a separate item.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
It does.
Well, Father, what's this going to cost? This is a lovely wish list, a wish list of priorities, ways that we want to get things done, but can we realistically afford it? So we took these plans, and that's where we worked over the course of the years. We're refining them with WAC construction. And last December of 2022, got a number of $5.4 million. That was a biddable number. And that number, but we couldn't bid it yet. Why couldn't we lock it in? Because we have to there's a whole approval process with Stafford County, and you were looking at best case scenario, hoping to break ground in the spring of 2024. So you couldn't lock in bids in December of 2022. So that 5.4, I've been saying in the visits that I've been doing very consistently, that's nice, but I'm still saying 6. Why was I saying 6? Because I said that 5.4 million includes 15% contingency. So the actual number was less than that by 15%. And so while that includes a contingency for cost overruns and inflation, That's not a lot of cushion, so I was adding more to that cushion to push it to 6. However, there's one other thing that's wasn't listed on your list of priorities here in the book, and you, in the recording here session, get to be the second folks to hear this, because we're bringing out information as we get it. And that's it. I went with, when we did this cost analysis with WAC, I said, okay, we're putting in new heating and HVAC, heating and air conditioning for the new spaces, but we've got systems that are 25 years old throughout this school, and systems that are held together with duct tape. That's hyperbole, it's not duct tape. But we're at the end of their lifespan, reasonably. And I said, what if we replace all the heating and air conditioning? And just a week ago, I got the number on that. It said expected delta of 800,000, which pushes our 5.4 to 6.2. Oh, the prophecy's true. So I do believe, while we haven't slotted that in as a priority, I believe that it would fundamentally be irresponsible to do all this work and then to turn around a year later when the HVAC for the older portions of the building fails and say, hey, we need $1.5 million. Because if you're doing it at a separate time when you're not in there, the number is going to be more, whatever that number would be. I haven't priced it out. And so looking at that, that's we really need to look at that and probably need to do it. But again, those are the hard decisions, how we sort through those priorities and what we can afford in a way that's reasonable. And because if we don't address the HVAC situation, then that would be very short-sighted and irresponsible. So that's really Holy Cross and how we got to that 6 million napkin number. All right, so looking at the St. Mary's campus, fundamentally here, we have a map, a bird's eye, an aerial map, satellite sort of map, I suppose, of our campus that shows on the bottom portion of the picture the church, the PLC, the parish offices. All of that area where the parish PLC and parish offices are is zoned for church. However, we own 8 other buildings, homes that are on the same city block. About an hour ago, I mentioned that while we'd cleared $3 million off the debt, we purchased one more property. It was the last house on this property, house that we call the St. Joseph House because we would like to use it for adult ed. That property came up. The owner of it contacted us and said, you own every other property on this block. Do you want ours? And we said, we're very interested. The daughter of the owner was a real estate agent, and so we had conversations. We got an appraisal. We offered to pay the appraisal, and she accepted it within 24 hours.
Awesome.
So it was really a generational opportunity, but that's also set us now on a course where we're working with the town and the neighbors, understanding that, yes, having a church in the neighborhood presents parking pressure on the local residents, and being sensitive to that is very important to us. But then also looking at how can we use these buildings and get permission from the city to use them for church purposes, because those 8 buildings are in a zone that's residential by right. And to use those properties, we need what's called a special use permit. So we're in the process, we've been working through that process, and in August of 2023, we actually have a date with the City Council for them to review this. And so that's a lot of work that's been done behind the scenes since we purchased that property 2 years ago to try to come up with a plan and a general development plan, and one that respects the neighbors by having sidewalks on the interior of the property so that we can access these buildings from our own parking lot and not from the neighborhood streets, and doing things like that to try to be good neighbors and be reasonable with them, but then also be able to use those. Once we get, God willing, and the town council willing, the permission to use some of these spaces that are zoned residential now, then we can move some of our adult meetings over into the St. Joseph House. And we can accomplish a few more things, because there's always a pressure for rooms for meetings on this campus. Doing that would then free up the Father Rooney room to become an adoration chapel. In fact, I think the next sketch is a little sketch of an adoration chapel where we put up an image. I actually had my niece do that. She said she was an artist and an architect and worked for an architect firm for a while. I'm like, can you do a concept sketch? And she said, I'll take 30 hours. I said, no. I want the 30-minute version. I gave her my 3-minute version, which was really ugly. And I said, you're an artist. In 30 minutes, you can take what I did in 3 and make it beautiful. Yeah. And she did.
It's gorgeous.
And we just wanted to capture the feel. Why do we want an adoration chapel? If you've been in that church, stop by to try to pray during the week. There's always 6,000 things going on. And having a space where it can be dedicated for quiet prayer during the week, but also then on weekends, we could have a baptism in there while something else is going on in another space. And so having another additional sacred place where you can have a baptism or a small wedding or small ceremonies like that would really be a help to the parish life.
Yep.
So those are some of the things we want to do with rezoning, with an adoration chapel. The PLC, I arrived 7 years ago and was told that roof was going to fail any day. It's still going, but it's going to need to be replaced relatively in the near future. The rectory was built back in 2010-12 when there were 3 priests in residence. We now have 5. When we have a seminarian or we had a priest from India this spring with us for a time, they have to shower over in the St. Joseph house. Once we start using that, that's not going to be an option. And so it's just really not big enough for the 5 priests in the seminary, and it really should be a little bit bigger. Some of the other things listed here, we want to improve the sanctuary, having moved the tabernacle to the center. We could improve the section on the right where the priest seats to get a little better seating for servers. I'd like to change the ventilation in the confessionals so that next time there's a pandemic, we'll be a little less anxious about the breathing and just kind of create a negative air pressure so we can help that. I think that would be improvement to the confessional. So this is a little more of a list when you look at the project, and we don't have dollars on any of these. Why? Because the first priority we're putting energy to is on the school. Second, the tent pole, meaning the thing that's kind of driving why we can't move forward with these things, is working on the zoning issue with the city. Because once we get that in order, then we can know what our parameters are, what our space available is, and how we can best use it. Then we could look at converting the Father Rooney room into an adoration chapel and expanding. Part of the things when we've asked for the zoning is we've described to the city that we would like to expand the rectory by, I want to say 600 square feet. Okay. Forgive me that I don't remember that number off the top of my head. Yeah. This all napkin number we're calling $1 million. Okay. That is really a napkin number. And once we've been working on the special use permit that'll cover all of the buildings. So it's very clear with the town what our permissions are to use the residential buildings for church purposes. But one of your questions had been, well, how do you get to 7? The 7 is starting at the most basic level, 6 for the school plus 1 for the smaller projects on the parish grounds. But the next thing I want to talk about before I get back into funding is timelines. And fascinating enough, there we go. There's the timeline slide. So that we started this campaign in April and May of 2022, which means I've been working it for well over a year now. And that's, again, working with the conceptual design and the campaign to say, how are we going to bring those two numbers into alignment so that we can actually plan and build what we can afford. We want to and need to, I will say even, break ground over at Holy Cross in 2024 for one reason that's become apparent through this process. And that's that groundwater laws in Stafford County are changing in January 1st, 2025. If we don't have a bulldozer out there and construction hasn't started, we'll be subject to the new regulations. We really want to get approval because the new ones are going to be increased dramatically from what I've been told. I don't have the specifics on that, but that was one of the things that WAC brought to our attention is why our timeline is realistic and possible.
Which could, mean more, cost, right?
Oh yeah.
Project.
A lot more ground work and water retention
I'm not sure
ponds.
about the new, I'm not sure about this, so I hadn't heard about this, so I don't know much about it.
That they brought it to my attention
Interesting.
as we were doing some of the design development and said this is why we want to get this. We want to get a bulldozer out there at the very least. But the timeline also, and I'll give a little more detail here because they can always cut this out of the video if needed. And that is that we're in June of this month, we've had about a dozen meetings to really sharpen the finishes and the design because we want to take the conceptual design and get biddable documents, permit documents. And so that's got to have all the things about finishes and everything. And those are the documents we're trying to finish this summer so that by August or September, we can start the process of putting them in front of Stafford County officials for the permitting process. At that point, then that's why one of the time frames that's been given to me is that we lay those again in front of the contractors to get biddable numbers so that we can get numbers, find out this fall what they are, and then break ground in the spring and bid that out. So that the idea then is you're trying to break ground so that you can do as much work as possible externally and build the calendar for construction around the school year so that the breakthroughs into current used facilities could happen during summer when we're not in session. And that way, if you have the summer of 24 to start a little bit of that and to make some of that connection, then you're really breaking through and finishing in the summer of 25 so that when you open in the fall of 25, God willing, you're in spaces. So that's how we're trying to target the phasing of the project, and that's why you hire contractors to say how to plan and program manage all those subs and getting everything done in a timely manner.
So what is the plan for the school year? As a parent with kids there, we want to make sure that we're paying for this education, that they're not being distracted by construction.
That's why you'd have the construction outside and not interfering, and you'd have to stage it in such a way, even in terms of time and when they can work, in a way that it's not interfering with the school day.
Great.
Could there be some construction? I foresee
Sure.
Where you've got areas that are blocked off, but you also have to pay attention to noise limits. For example, it's only by analogy, but I can say, having built a church, and that I'm used to the principle of telling contractors these are the hours when you can't be making noise right next door because we got a mass going on. So those sorts of things are part of things that historically and traditionally, you're working with the contractor to make sure that you can still educate.
Great. I appreciate that.
So the timeline on the parish projects, the primary, as I call it, the tentpole there is this special use permit. Because they're smaller projects that require less funding, we'll stage those according to our ability to manage them. But the most important really tentpole, which is why the timelines in the booklet are focused on the Holy Cross project, because that's the big question and the big overwhelming project. The next slide actually is one that I'm going to click through really fast. This was about capital campaign phases, and so that the first person to make a pledge was me. And I'll tell a story. Put this one on tape. Why not? Because how did it get to be that way? Because when I was a young priest, the very first time I was involved in a capital campaign was the bishop asked me to make a pledge to the diocesan capital campaign. And I remember when I was asked, I was frustrated, I was annoyed, I was even a little angry. My fundamental response was, doesn't he know I've given my whole life? Why would he ask me for money? And once I got over my emotional reaction like that, I said to myself, he is my boss. He deserves the respect of a listen. And so I went to listen to what the case was for the diocesan capital campaign. I listened to the case and understood then that I would be also asking parishioners and helping with this work because, amen on the priest. And when I came out of there, I said, these are real needs. And I, as a leader, can't ask anybody to do what I'm not willing to do. And because of that, I made a pledge. And I've taken that as a principle always, that if I'm not willing to do it, I can't ask you to do it. So in this case, yeah, that's why I made the first pledge. The second pledge was the principal, Dr. Fry. He's told this story that when we got to the end of our meeting like this, he said, no one's ever asked me to make a 5-year pledge before. This is a new way of thinking. To which I said, it really is. Yeah. Thank you for prayerfully considering. And he made the next pledge. Next were the priests of the parish, the parochial vicars. And then we took it to leadership, the parish council. This graph and this part of the booklet is really about saying, hey, the campaign went first with leadership. Then we selected 300 families and said, you're leaders, you lead ministries, you're generous with the parish. And this was all behind the scenes before it was announced. So that we could, when we would announce to the school, when we would announce to the parish, we would have all this success layered out there. And that's why we kind of expanded in concentric circles. So that by the time we announced to the school in October of 2022, we already had several million pledged. We announced to the parish in December. And so that's encouraging people, oh, this isn't just a dream. Like behind the scenes, people have been quietly making a commitment to make this happen. That's what all the phasing is about. So the next slide here is about describing, fundamentally putting in the simplest visual form, what are the things we need to pay for that we're proposing to do, and how do we pay for it? So that's project expenses and funding. You see on the project expense line, we have Holy Cross at $6 million, the parish center at $1 million. I spent a lot of that's why all the detail on those napkin numbers. Yeah. And then the church debt, which currently stands at 1.2 million. When we started this in April, that number was originally 1.9. So in April of 2022 it was 1.9. That's how much money we've cleared off that debt by being aggressive this year, which is great. That's the expenses. On the funding side, we have 1.6 million in savings, and then we're saying to fully fund all of this, $7 million. Okay. All right. So let me describe that 1.6, because you would say, why do we have 1.6 million in savings and a debt of 1.2? Who does that? The answer is we do that because when people give money dedicated for a specific cause, it has to be used for that. The principle is the intention of the donor is sacred. If you give me money for something, I have to use it for that. If I don't, I have to return that money to you. Yes, the intention of the donor is sacred. This is a critical principle. So that we have $915,000 in the bank in the St. Joseph Fund that was given only for expansion. That's why that money has never been spent except for the one expenditure on the cost estimate, which is a cost of building. So that's $900,000. So when you look at those project expenses that add up to over $8 million, clearing the debt and then Holy Cross and the parish needs. Then you look at the funding, the 1.6 million, as we mentioned, the $915,000 for St. Joseph's Fund. Then we identify saying, okay, to fully fund everything, we need about a $7 million capital campaign. That's how we got to that number. But let me give you, because people are interested in why we have 1.6 million in savings and this debt on the table. So there's the 915 in the St. Joseph's Fund. But one of the things people will say, well, where's your money? Okay, we have a checking account with First Union. That's where our money is. So does the school. And but our savings accounts are all with the Dial. That's a Diocesan Investment and Loan Corporation, Dial Corp. This is a corporation set up by the diocese. I use the analogy of It's a Wonderful Life. Like, well, okay, what does that mean? We send our money to George Bailey. Just like in It's a Wonderful Life, everybody had their money on deposit. When, Martini needed to build his home, they borrowed money, they used money from somebody else's deposit. That's how that worked in that lovely, wonderful movie, right? Yeah. So that we send our money up to the diocese. The Dial Corp is the corporation that's set up to receive that. And if another parish needs to build, they borrow money from that. So we don't actually borrow money from secular banks. We're borrowing from this diocesan source. And that's great and wonderful. The good news is there is no Mr. Potter and there is no Uncle Billy. The money is not kept in an envelope, with strings on the finger. The Diocesan Finance Committee oversees a subcommittee and is reviewing the reports, and it's invested. And frankly, we would all do, if we could all invest as well as the Dial has been invested, we'd be all very happy. Consistently overperforming market. And that led to a situation, as I describe it, where the money that was sent up to this corporation, we want to really reduce it to, we'll call it the little pot of gold. It's not just sitting, under a rainbow somewhere. It's invested. And because it's invested, that money doesn't belong to the bishop. It belongs to parishes, schools, all these other diocesan entities. And because it was invested, I'm going to generalize here. There's about $100 million worth of deposits. It grew to $160 million. So the bishop had we've got all this money from the investment growing, and we've been paying out interest, but we've got way more in assets than we do in loans and deposits receivable. So a couple of years ago, he gave out a dividend. He said, this is your money. We're going to give it to parishes because your money grew beyond what the simple interest rate we were paying. So every parish and every school and every diocesan entity got one. It was based on how much money you had deposited to be proportionate to it's your money that grew. Sure. It was also Catholic insofar as smaller parishes, there was a floor so that everybody would get at least $50K to say, well, let's help out the smaller parishes because they're smaller and they don't have the same savings. So that dividend led to St. Mary's it's called extraordinary dividend. And if in the group project on that slide, we have a lovely slide that talks about St. Mary's getting an extraordinary dividend of $137,000 at the parish. The school, $240,000. We'd had money in there for the St. Joseph Fund. It grew. That's incredible. When the bishop gave this dividend, he said he did put a request on it. He said, look, I want you to use this for capital expenditures. And like, hey, we've got capital expenditures coming down the pike. So that, therefore, that 242, you add that to the 950K, and now you're at 1.15 approximately in cash on hand, ready to be spent on the school expansion. The parish, as I said, had 137 from that dividend. The parish also has another 162 from a joint campaign. And this was a couple years ago. A large gift initiative was the name of the program. And it was something where they were seeking large gifts to support some diocesan projects. But a percentage came back to the parish. And it was also, hey, we want you to use this for a capital expenditure. Well, what has the parish been doing since 2010 and 12? It's been trying to lower its debt and save to build Holy Cross. So that money has been sitting there for all that time because I, in good conscience, couldn't say, well, let me spend this money on the parish campus because then everybody would say, why are you spending $160K on a capital expenditure here when we've been promised this school for years?
Makes sense.
So that's why the parish has, I'm gonna round those numbers slightly. I'll call that $300,000 that's on the parish side that can be used for capital expenditures. And it was 1.15, so that gets you to 1.45. Okay, so there's another 150,000. Why? Because at the end of last year, I said, Father Mosimann, we've got about $200,000 because we kept our expenses tight at the end of the year. We can pay down capital on our loan and get rid of that, but we're trying to do a capital campaign. What if we have expenses associated with that? Why don't we set aside some money? And so we did. We set aside $200,000, sent it up to savings so that we would be in a position to absorb costs for a capital campaign. That's how you get to the 1.6 million in cash. And that's, breaking down a heck of a lot of detail on that, I know. But those are reasonable questions. Then you say to me, well, Father Mosimann, why would we fully fund everything? Why do you want to raise enough money to pay for everything? And the answer is, what's the biggest problem on the campus of the church?
Parking.
Blessed be the Lord, parking. So we're not resolving parking in this campaign. There is and with the special use permit and the plan, when we look at the properties of those houses, there's not a good way to add parking there.
Okay.
And keep those houses. And we want to keep the residential feel in the neighborhood. So the best solution for parking is the property on the other side. I believe it may be called the Rose Hill property, but that's not ours.
Yeah.
There's a whole history there that I'll spare from recording. If that gentleman ever watches this, I would love to meet you and talk to you so I can hear your side of the story and your perspective as to what's gone into that. But my understanding is that a portion of that property, not the whole property, but the plot closest to the parish that the church has right of first refusal written onto the deed as express will of the lady who lived there, who passed away and gave it to her son when she passed away. But that if it were to ever be sold, the church could buy that one property. That could help us with parking. I would love to have the church in a situation where that we can fully fund everything so we can accomplish these things and then start to amass some savings. So if that property goes on, we're not coming back out and saying, oops, we need more money. Or if there's a major roof failure, that we don't have to turn around right on the heels of doing a campaign and saying, hey, we need X money. I'd love to put the parish in a spot where it has some savings and strength to be able to handle some of those big sorts of needs. That's why we're showing fully fund everything, capital campaign, $7 million to fully fund everything. I have avoided using the word goal for the campaign. Why? Because I don't want people saying our target is 7 million or bust. Can the parish afford to have some loan out? Yes, we've shown that we can pay down a loan. This is why at where we are now with dollars pledged, I'm actually very confident we can accomplish this. But there are reasons why, to keep encouraging everybody to participate. So we're looking at that and saying the hard questions will involve, can we manage still some debt? Do we get the campaign sufficient to fully fund everything, or do we still carry a little bit of debt? That's why where we are already is a success. That's why where we are already, I believe it's happening. And it's why I'm moving forward and spending money on design documents and biddable documents and all sorts of things to expand Holy Cross, because I believe we can make it happen. So that's the overall funding picture. There is a slide about short and long-term giving, and I break this down to understanding that, yes, our Sunday offertory supports our regular operations, our salaries, our expenses, the regular maintenance and such, and the subsidy that we give to the school. And the long-term questions, the capital campaign, we're trying to address those. Analogously, in family life, your regular expenses are your food, your mortgage, your gas, your electricity, and your internet, because we can't survive without internet. Amen. Blessed be the Lord. But there are other questions that you have to ask yourself as a family. Can we afford a new car? Can Can we afford a bigger house? Can we afford to take a vacation? Those are those are sorts of questions that people ask in a different category. In the same way in parish life, the capital campaign is kind of addressing those sorts of questions, not the ordinary. It also means that, yes, folks have said to me, well, can I reduce my Sunday offertory and give it to the campaign? I'm like, no, please don't, because we still have all those expenses. So we try to, that's why we have half a page dedicated to explaining that sort of distinction. What is every family asked? Every family is asked, will you prayerfully consider making a pledge over time to Holy Cross Academy and St Mary the Immaculate Conception to help grow our legacy of faith? We're asking for your prayerful consideration. That's the fundamental question. And when I talk about that, then, of course, because I'm Father Mosimann, I never just say the simple version. I give you more principles. No family is expected to give a specific amount, period. Like, it's just not the way it is. I don't know your situation. And I'm asking you to prayerfully consider. Only you can prayerfully discern what's a sacrifice for you and where your circumstances are. Why are we asking for 5-year pledges? Because it helps people stretch further. We're not trying to hide anything. By asking people what they consider doing over 5 years, it ends up giving us a way that we can project, here's the money that's going to come in, and therefore we will have the money to be able to pay this and build this as it comes. One of the principles that I've asked folks is, could you prayerfully consider an answer in 7 to 10 days? Why do I put a time frame on it? I use the analogy, Amazon tries to resell you what you searched for 2 weeks ago. Why? Because they know you've forgotten why you didn't buy. You just remember your desire to buy. I'm asking people to prayerfully consider, well, they've got this hour plus of data in their brains, and understand why and the hows. That's why I'm asking people to do it while it's fresh in their mind and to make an informed decision. Folks will say to us, when do you want me to begin? I'm like, yes, you tell me, is the answer. It's utterly up to folks. For example, I use an example of one gentleman was unemployed. He got a job. He accepted a visit within a week of getting a job so that he could hear. And he said, can I wait a year so I get my feet back on my feet? I've been unemployed for 6 months. My answer was, God bless you. Absolutely. We put on the pledge card a little line that says, when do you want to begin? So that people are telling us, again, what they can do and when they can do it. Every gift is a blessing. One of the things that I've laid out a little bit for Holy Cross, and I think this is important for Holy Cross families especially to understand, because they can ask, well, how does this benefit me? In addition to, you're in a building built by others, most families are not aware that St. Mary, the Immaculate Conception, provides a subsidy to Holy Cross to the tune of $200,000 to $250,000 cash per year. That means that every child, even if their parents are paying full tuition without any aid, is underwritten that education to the tune of $500 to $600 a year. I think that's important for families to know.
Yeah.
I think it's important for the whole parish to know. Why would we do that? Because this is an important ministry. In the same way that we pay for youth ministry salaries, we pay for other employees, because this is our mission of handing on the faith. So I'm glad for that, but I think it's good for parents to know, because sometimes folks can approach a school in a little bit of a transactional way as a customer. In addition to that, there's another, I believe the number was $67,000 last year that we paid into a different fund. What's that fund? We pay into a fund at the diocese to help students who need to get Catholic education. Every parish pays into that fund. St. Mary's paid in $67,000 to that. The money went up to the diocese. But it's not the bishop's money. It's money that's distributed to all schools. So St. Mary's received, I'm going to peek at my numbers there. Okay. So St. Mary, Holy Cross Academy received from that diocesan fund that St. Mary's paid $67,000 into it. Holy Cross received $280,000 in identified need-based aid. That's great. You know, that's how it's one of the huge ways. Yes, the school is creative in some other ways of getting some other community grants and stuff. And God bless the school faculty. They're doing a great job of trying to get help to those who need it. In addition to that, $67,000 that comes from St. Mary's and gets grown by contributions from other parishes. St. Mary's directly with the school gives another $77,000 in aid. That was last year's number. That number for the coming year is actually going up. We don't always advertise that number specifically, you know, but I think it's important for folks to know that just in terms of, okay, there is a lot of aid and the parish is doing that. I'll say one of the other things that I haven't checked these numbers recently, but at an early stage when we had the first $1 million pledged, I asked our campaign director, that qualified, wonderful lady, how much of that money was given by families, Holy Cross families. It was 10%. So at that point, 90% of the dollars pledged to build, where when you look at debt and everything, 2/3 of the money is going to Holy Cross. 90% of that money is coming from the parish and people with no connection to the school. I also think that's important for Holy Cross families to understand how much the parish and the people of the parish have their back and believe in Catholic education. And so that's all part of the context here for how we get to where we're going. On the last page in the booklet is a pledge chart. And I call this the normal person pledge chart. We had a leadership pledge chart that had a top number of $1 million. And people say, really? There was a parishioner who gave $1 million to another charity a couple of years ago. I saw the article in the Freelance Star. Unfortunately, I haven't yet been able to sit down with that gentleman. And so by not asking numbers, there are numbers all over the scale here. The normal person chart shows 100,000 to 6,000 as 5-year sorts of numbers. And why? Because it's a fishing trip. I don't know what anybody's resources are. We have, on this scale here in the booklet with 100,000 to 6,000, we have pledges at every one of these levels from the parish. We have a pledge above that. We have plenty of pledges below that level. Again, if my answer is always thank you, it is always thank you. We do try to break that down into practical terms. So that the example I use, for example, is my cell phone bill is about $100 a month. That, if I were to pledge what I pay for my cell phone, over 5 years, that's $6,000, because that's 60 months. Our cable and internet bill is a little bit more than $200. If I pledge $200, like a cable internet bill, that's $12,000. Those are generous gifts. That really matters. I used an example when I was in Manassas, talking to my day laborers, people who went to 7-Eleven to look to see if they would find cash work on a given day. I asked them, could you possibly give up one Starbucks or one Happy Meal a week? And they said, yeah. I said, if you put that $5 in an envelope, at the end of the month, you got $25. $25 over 5 years, that's $1,500. That matters.
Absolutely.
Everything matters. So I don't know where anybody is, but everything does matter, and everything fundamentally helps. When we created a chart for the group meetings, one of the ladies said, well, a manicure and a pedicure is $50 a month. Like, that ends up being $3,000 over 5 years. I wasn't qualified to comment on that one, so I leave that one as what is. But, you know, it's a question of, is there something that I can sacrifice in gratitude? We use the scripture in that page and throughout of the widow's mite, because that really ultimately is the measure. Only the Lord can measure sacrifice. That's why my answer is always thank you no matter what, because I can't measure anyone's sacrifice.
Yep.
I do tell the story in Leesburg of a gentleman who, when I was building the church there, the visitor came back and they said, Father, I visited this gentleman and his salary is, I don't remember the exact number, but it was below the poverty line. It was like $12,000 or $13,000 a year, and lived in Loudoun County.
Oh.
And I was like, what? Like, help. Like, God bless this guy. Thank you for receiving a visit. And that gentleman came in 2 weeks or so later after the visit and asked to talk to me. And I stepped out of my office. I'm like, thank you so much for taking a visit. And before I could say much of anything else besides thank you, he said, Father, I'm giving up smoking and I'm going to give my cigarette money.
Oh,
Oof.
wonderful.
And I just said, I was like, that's the widow's mite. That man giving his cigarette money, I firmly believe we will find in eternity, did more to build that $16 million church than anybody. Because of that, my answer is always thank you. And I can say that. I know that people are afraid to believe that I really mean it, but I do. It's why when they say, can you prayerfully consider a pledge? The answer is always, always, always and everywhere, thank you. One of the things that I also like to highlight from the pledge chart is the column furthermost on the right is saying, hey, to fully fund it, we need X number of gifts over at each of these sorts of levels. And it's a way also of showing people like, yes, these $6,000, these $12,000 pledges, and the $3,000 and the $15,000, every one of them really matters. And to see, and that distribution comes from basic statistical analysis, capital campaigns of how things might be spread out. Excuse me. And so we break that down in that chart to annual or monthly. I personally am doing annually because when I look at my Excel spreadsheet where I keep my checkbook, it's a round number that I can see. And it just visually, I know, oh, I took care of it this year. I don't have to worry about it till next year. Again, everyone does whatever works best for them. Some folks have said, hey, do you want me to send you a check? Do you want me to use Faith Direct or church envelope? Yes. Again, whatever you want. Some folks have already used Faith Direct and have set up pledges. We do ask folks to fill out a pledge card. Why? Because I'll call it a sacramental way. You're putting it on paper. You're making a good faith commitment.
Sure.
It is a good faith commitment. It is not a contract. We know that statistically, some people will die, some people will move, some people will lose their jobs and have their economic realities change. So that when someone is unable to follow through on what they committed to, my answer is again, thank you for trying. God bless you. Thank you. Lord love you. Anything we can do to help. And that's important because statistically you're not going to get every dollar pledged. I'm hopeful by trying to reduce pressure points that we'll get a higher percentage of redemption. And I'm hopeful that people freely selecting their amount rather than trying to stretch to make Father happy, that will increase the percentage of redemption. But I believe it's going to work in a lot of ways like that. The amazing news is that we have $5,180,000 pledged at this point.
Amazing.
Wow.
That's on approximately 550 pledges. And so that's great. You look at that $5 million pledged and you say, whoa, we're getting there with our ability to finance a little and carry a little bit loan. This is going to happen. And it will. And so that's the encouraging thing. Yes, we're still trying to fully fund everything. Yes, we want everybody to have an opportunity to participate and be on this winning team. And so the average pledge is around $11,800. I rounded just a digit or two there. The average one-time gift ends up being about $1,700. And I find that fascinating that when you look at the people who stretched, that number for 5 years ends up being just a little bit more than 5 times what the average one-time gift is. And that shows some of the thinking is that some folks are saying, I can do this now, and they're able to do it. And other folks are stretching and saying, all right, I can do this now. I believe I'll be able to do this each year. I find that correlation slightly intriguing. But in the end, our answer to every family is always, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for your time in all seriousness. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, to contact Donna Herring, the parish offices, get messages to any of us. We'll be happy to answer and address any questions that you might have. I'll share with you one more thing because that's what I like to do. This window, pictured on the cover of our booklet, is a window that's in production right now in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a company called Lynchburg Glass. It's a beautiful window, and one of the things that I wanted for the chapel was an image of Our Lady and St. Joseph. And it's a company that I worked with previously that does amazing work. And I asked the gentleman, why are the windows you made for me so much more beautiful than what I normally see? And he said, Father, 2 reasons. One, you're willing to use a traditional style and iconography that lots of people love. And 2, Father, when I give you a price, you don't argue about dollars per square inch. You pay what you get for. And that's allowed him to put his best artist on these windows. So they're in production right now for Holy Cross. I actually hope to have them already in the chapel by this point. However, when I called him recently, he said, Father, my number one artist is wrapping up a commission that's taken a little longer than expected. That's why they're not yet painted to be sealed. The other window I'm very proud of, and I'll nerd out here for a minute, and that's an image of St. Joseph. I wanted an image of St. Joseph with a young Jesus in the carpentry shop working because I thought this sort of tween age for Jesus would be a beautiful image for our students in that age group in the school to see our Lord working with St. Joseph. I gave to Lynchburg Glass a picture of a statue of St. Joseph the Worker. That led to several iterations where I started using my photography chops, my love of photography, to turn and rotate Jesus to make sure that Jesus's face is on the rule of thirds as photography goes, so that when you look at this, your eyes go immediately to Jesus's face. And then they drift around the picture and see St. Joseph standing behind him in terms of the composition and helping it to just capture a little moment when, because Jesus is in the foreground, you don't see his feet. You know that Jesus is shorter and younger. I will give credit as well to Elena Doyle, who works for me, because one of the drafts, she came back and she's like, Father, Jesus, his arms are too buff. He needs to have boy arms. His arms were much more muscular, like St. Joseph. You can see the definition of the muscles there. She said, if he's a young boy, he has to have boy arms that aren't cut with muscles yet because he's young. And I was like, and it was amazing. That little change just visually helped to communicate the age of our Lord. I really love how that image turned out, so much so that I have this frame that I actually have it hanging over the rectory as a little reminder of our Lord and St. Joseph. So little tidbits. These are windows in production that are going to be in the chapel over at Holy Cross, and also a sign and inspiration, I hope, to people of the parish that yes, you can do beautiful things if you want. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your assistance. And thank you for everything you do to help St. Mary and Holy Cross Academy grow our legacy of faith. God bless you.